Hey everybody, it's Zach again at newtotorah.com. I wanted to come in and do a video. I was asked by some friends about Paul, and most of you know I just did a video on Paul. Paul or God, where do we get our commandments from? And I think that clarified some things. But I wanted to kind of go into a little more detail about all that. And it's this. Whenever you see Paul in the New Testament talking about the law, basically understand that he's talking about the Torah. Paul was a Torah scholar. It says in the books of Acts that Paul was a student of Gamaliel. To be a student of Gamaliel, you really should do some research on who Gamaliel was. Something you can do your due diligence on and go out and do some research about. But it mentions Gamaliel in the book of Acts, in the New Testament. And Paul says he studied at the feet of Gamaliel. Gamaliel, to be a student, just to be a student of Gamaliel, you had to have some requirements met first. You had to have the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, memorized word for word, just by your memory, before you could be even a student of Gamaliel and learn the greater things of the Torah. And so Paul was that person. Paul understood and could recite the Torah word for word. He was a Torah scholar. And so to understand Paul, you have to understand that he was very knowledgeable of the Torah and what the law stated. And so when you see things like Paul saying that the law is a curse, understand that he's not saying that the law itself is a curse. He's talking about the law brings a curse, because all throughout the Torah, when you read Leviticus and Deuteronomy, it lists a whole number of curses. It says curses that come upon you when you disobey, when you break these commandments. A number of curses are very specific even. Things like your economic abilities and your procreating abilities and things like that. It's very specific, and some aren't so specific. But it says that, when you break these commandments, your curse is going to come upon you. And so when Paul says, because we're all sinners, we are under the curse of the law. He's not saying the law is a curse. This law itself is a curse. He's saying the punishment we deserve for breaking it is a curse upon us. And so our Messiah, Yeshua, Jesus, that some of you may know him as, when he died freeing us from the curse of the law, he was freeing us from the punishment the law brings when we break it. So here's what I want to leave you with. When you understand Paul, when you try to go back through Paul and you hear about all of these people who say, but Paul says, understand that Paul, when he's talking about the curse of the law, or not being under the law anymore, a number of verses from Romans and Galatians especially, understand that he's talking about one of only 2 things. And this really goes for all of the New Testament. Number 1 being the curse of the law, the punishment the law brings. When you're under the law, you're under the punishment the law brings when you break it. Okay, that's what he's talking about by when he says under the law. Or the second thing that you need to keep in mind is the fact that the law of traditions and doctrines of man, because man would create their own laws. And we saw this a lot by those who, the Judaizers, the people who are of the Jewish religion, because a lot of the people in the days of our Messiah and in the days of Paul would have their own moral and lawful ways traditions basically that they had made up that are not found anywhere in the Torah. And so when he says, hey, listen, you're not under this law, understand he's not talking about the Torah. He's talking about the traditions and doctrines of man's law, these ways that you have to do these certain things, otherwise you're not considered saved. And Paul is simply saying, hey, listen, following the law is not going to get you salvation. The works of the law are not going to achieve salvation. It's just not. Anytime you go, like for instance, circumcision. I get this question a lot about circumcision. Paul is against circumcision. He's not against circumcision. He's against circumcision as a way of salvation, because people of the Jewish religion, the Judaizers, the circumcision party is what they were called, were saying that you cannot be saved unless you're circumcised. That's not what the Torah says. The Torah says you're saved by faith. Abraham's faith was counted towards him as righteousness, not his circumcision. The circumcision of Abraham's heart came first, and then his circumcision of the flesh. If Paul is so against circumcision, why did he circumcise Timothy? Paul's not against circumcision. If you do a word search on circumcision in the Old Testament, you will find more than often, you will see that it's always about the circumcision of the heart. If you go back to Ezekiel 44, you will see circumcision mentioned in there twice, and it's always the heart before the flesh. Always the heart before the flesh. If your heart's not circumcised, your flesh means nothing. Circumcising your flesh is not going to get you to heaven, but circumcising your heart to the Father's commandments is. It says this also in Jeremiah. It's always about the circumcision of the heart. And so what I'm going to leave you with, what I'm hoping you will understand, is that when Paul is talking, and this is something that I didn't know just a few short years ago until I really studied it out, I understood that, oh my goodness, Paul is not talking about the law. He's talking about the punishment the law brings when we break it. He's talking about the oral law, the traditions and doctrines of man, what is today called the Talmud, these things, these rules that they have in place where you have to wash your hands before you eat. And they were accusing Yeshua, our Messiah, of not washing your hands before you ate. And he says, listen, this is not, you're putting the traditions and doctrines of man over the commandments of God. There's nowhere in the Torah does it say you have to wash your hands before you eat. It makes good sense to do that. But their ritualistic washing of hands does not get you into heaven. And so they were making that point. They were trying to say you have to follow this law. You have to wash these pots or pans the same way. And today in Israel, you have these Jews who go by these oral traditions, these oral laws that are not found anywhere in the Torah. Keep that in mind. Traditions and doctrines of man versus the commandments of God. Mark 7 is very clear about this. Had nothing to do with food. The words in parentheses in verse 19 are not found in any Greek text. They're not found in any copyrighted Bible in the last 50 years, in fact. If you look at verse 19, those words that are in parentheses there that people most often throw at me. Folks, it's either traditions and doctrines of man or the punishment of the law. That's what Paul's talking about. And so keep that in mind. Look at that. Study that out further. Understand that anytime someone throws Paul at you, see if it fits into those two categories. Now, there are other things that Paul writes about, like, for instance, in Romans 14. People try to say that Romans 14 is how we know that the Sabbath, we can celebrate the Sabbath any day now. The verse in verse 5, it says, let not one man esteem one day above another. Well, really, that has nothing to do with the Sabbath at all. The word Sabbath isn't even used in the entire chapter of Romans 14, let alone the whole book of Romans. The word Sabbath isn't used. So the context there is not the Sabbath. If you count the word eat or ate, eating, it's used between 6 and 10 times depending on what Bible version you're using. So in Romans 14. So understand, go back and just in the first 10 verses, or first 6 verses, I think, the context there is eating. It's about fasting. Let no man esteem one day above another for fasting. And so people throw that out at me all the time about Paul. And so you have to understand there are other things, that people talk about Paul, and maybe in 1 Timothy and some others, that understand that Paul is talking about, you need to actually examine the context that it's used in. Romans 14 is not about the Sabbath. Anytime you hear Paul talking about the law, which seems to put the law in a bad light, he's talking about the curse the law brings when you break it, or not being under the punishment of the law. Try to fit those verses that people throw at you in one of those two categories. And then second, keep in mind that you need to read things in context. Romans 14 is a prime example because it gets thrown at me all the time. To keep the Sabbath, the fourth commandment, that is something that we are to keep forever throughout our generations. We are to set one day aside to rest. To rest. We can worship any day you want, but one day is set aside. The seventh day is to rest. All right, so I was hoping to make that for a friend who was asking me some questions about Paul and was being confused with some of Paul and just couldn't grasp all this yet. And so I just wanted to throw that out there. Try to fit what Paul says and what people tell you about Paul into one of those two categories: the traditions and doctrines of man, man's law versus God's commandments, and the punishment for the law, the curse the law brings when we break it. All right, that's it. Well, we'll leave it at that. See my video that I did, Paul or God, because God says so, or because Paul says so. I'll link it at the bottom of the description. All right, that's it. Go home, read your Bible. Thanks.